As we all know that software identity was built for humans, service accounts, and predictable apps. But agents don't behave that way. You have probably noticed AI agents aren't asking for permission anymore. They are making decisions and taking actions. But here's the problem. Our identity systems were built for humans clicking buttons, not autonomous code that is constantly adapting and changing. So, how do we tackle this problem in this stage? Today, we have with us Ian Livingstone, co founder and CEO of Keycard, to explain why the old model breaks and what execution time access actually look like and what are potential solutions. First of all, Ian, great to have you on the show.
Awesome. I'm so pleased to be here. I'm really excited to talk about this. And I think it's one of the most interesting topics in agentic security, right? As we think about our move from human computing or human native computing, where humans are directly interacting and making all the decisions to a world where agents are doing that on our behalf. And we're spending a lot more time focusing on higher value activities. How do we actually, secure what those agents can do? And they operate very differently. As you mentioned, they're inherently probabilistic and non-deterministic. That's actually the feature. And anyways, I'm very excited to talk about that with you today.
What is interesting is that no matter which technology we are talking about, when we start talking about security, access control, privacy, that means the technology has matured. It is in production because that is why we are talking about these things. So, which actually is a good signal that yes, this is all mature and ready for production. Before we actually deep dive into the whole access control, I would love to know a bit about the company itself. Keycard, your co-founder, talk a bit about the history and story of the company. When did you create the company? What is specific problem you wanted to solve, which no one else was solving, that led to Keycard?
We started the company about a year ago, and originally we started the company to think about the fact that when you were building an application, over the last 20 years as we moved to the cloud, underneath all of that app was like a lot of these long-lived API keys, right? You would, API key for OpenAI or like your AWS credentials. And we recognized that one, not only was that like a pain for security in terms of like their ability to manage all these different, keys that live on people's computers or in the cloud or connect their apps together, but also that it was actually a pain for developers. And so we started the company to think about what would it look like to build single sign-on for machines so that machines could interact with each other and security folks would have an ability to influence how those things could do that and also have an ability to sort of stop interaction at the application layer across networks and network boundaries. That's what we got started with doing. I've been thinking about the problem for 15 years, associated with like how to make it really easy for developers to build systems and how to make security's job really easy. And then, as soon as we started the company, agents became real. And that's when we started thinking about, okay, the first thing we thought about, like our first initial reason to start the company was true then. But more importantly, we realized that agents are this whole new class of actor that look a lot like traditional workload identity or traditional services, but also they act a lot like humans. And in fact, you have this interaction between humans and machines that never really existed before, right? Because agents effectively broke down a lot of boundaries as they work across internal and external systems on behalf of themselves, on behalf of their agents, and also on behalf of humans, and realized that like the existing sort of security stuff wasn't going to be enough to enable people to take these things into production. So ultimately, that's what Keycard does for you.
As you also touched upon the traditionally or even today, software release systems were built for humans and fairly static workloads. What changes when the actor is not a human but an agent that can reason, adapt, and take action on its own? And as you rightly mentioned, they are behaving more or less like humans now.
In truth, we kind of like for the last 2 or 3 years, like agents started to arise with the dawn of chat GPT, right? We had, and then with chat, it was like, in effect, like a better question answer system. And it was a co-pilot effectively. It was an assistant to the human. And what we're seeing now in the last 3 or 4 months with things like Opus 4.5, ChatGPT 5.2 coming out, and then things like OpenClaw, is we're seeing a progression in terms of the capability of the model to enable like true autonomous use cases. These things can actually go off and complete a task on their own and reason through it with owner involvement. And so we're actually seeing the dawn, what I see, of like the agent native computing era. And that's different than everything that's come before. And requires a system and a way of thinking where As a human, I want to be able to describe like intent, right? I'm going to say, hey, can you go help me find the best pair of jeans? Or hey, can you help me think about how I build this type of system? Or hey, can you help me make this change? Go off and do it. And then that system's actually interpreting that intent, coming up with a plan, implementing that plan, and then underneath the hood is requiring to gather a lot of data from lots of different systems, and it's also then performing actions on those systems. And ultimately, what you want as a user, but also a security person, is the ability to ensure that that agent's only going to gather the data that that user wants that agent to have, and also that the organization wants that agent to have. But more importantly, also enable that agent to not keep the capability of the agent and what it's doing aligned with the original intent of the user, right? So if you say, "Hey, agent, I'd love you to go um, figure out how we could make this S3 bucket more optimized or what the best pair of jeans are." You don't want it to be able to, buy the pair of jeans. You just want it to figure out what pair of jeans it could buy. And you certainly don't want it to go and delete the S3 bucket. You just want it to tell you how you could do it, right? And the challenges today is that oftentimes when that user is interacting with that agent's actually inheriting all of the privileges and all of the access that user has. And ultimately, there is no capacity for that user to control, hey, what is this agent actually capable of doing on my behalf? Because the underlying systems don't support it. And that's the challenge that most have today, and is one of the reasons that we don't have many agents running autonomously in production, is because there's an underlying security problem that has to be resolved. That's both a problem for the user of the agent, it's also a problem for the person who built the agent, but it's also a problem for the person the people that are governing what that agent's interacting with.
Now, from technical point of view, why do coding agents and autonomous systems break traditional identity and access model? What's the core mismatch here?
Yeah, I think so. There's a couple of things. One is agents are not static in the sense that they have the same static permissions. So you have basically two worlds of identity today. You have systems built for human access, right? So validating that a human is someone you trust. And in those systems, you basically say, hey, I think Ian is Ian, and I trust Ian to have broad-based access because I trust that Ian has good judgment and good incentive. And not always does Ian do that because he's fallible and human, but on a risk-adjusted basis, I generally trust that to be true. And then on a individual basis, like on a workload basis, basically workloads, because are deterministic, and a human has written every line of code for that thing and it's gone through code review, and that's a part of like, how do we ensure that this thing doesn't do something wrong? Workloaded systems have been designed for a very static scope world where it's like, oh, this service only needs access to be able to read data from the user's database. It doesn't need to do all this other different stuff. In reality, agents operate a lot like humans in the sense that they need to have a broad-based access to many different systems, and they need to be able to reason about what things they need to have access to. And at the same time, agents also, when you send them off to do a piece of work, you want them to have, based on the stage of work, you want that agent to have very scope access to systems. For example, if I say something like, please help me figure out which database contains this type of information, I don't want it to go and take that information and you send it to some other system. And I certainly don't want it to take that information and take something that is considered highly sensitive back to the agent. And I certainly don't want it to have the ability to then delete that data or make any modifications to that data. I just want it to be able to have very scoped access. And then as I work with that agent as that task evolves, as that session evolves, that agent's going to want to have different permissions, and you want to still be able to tie that back both to the user who said, hey, agent, you can in fact do this thing, right? So you have that lineage of who told this agent they could have that access, but also so that we have a security model that is dynamic, right? And the fundamental issue today with existing identity systems is they're built first and foremost only for authentication and not authorization. And they're built for a static model of the world where you either have static workloads or static role-based access controls for users, humans. And in agents, you actually need dynamic, and they are static on a very shallow basis, but hyper dynamic across all the different tasks they do.
Let's talk from the perspective of teams. When teams try to use static credentials and, of course, pre-scope permission for agents, what actually goes wrong in the real world? Because let's not even talk about agents hallucinating or not following the prompt properly, but from technical point of view, what are the things that do go wrong where teams panic?
Absolutely. So what ends up happening is first and foremost, the security team at a company doesn't actually know what those agents can do, right? What they see is a user performing like actions. It doesn't know, they don't know whether it's the user or it's the agent. So if something were to go wrong, they can't be like, oh, it's because they're using an agent or it's because the user actually approved that. More importantly, it means that they can't write rules, right? In most companies, if Ian goes to Snowflake and looks at customer private information, that may be okay because we really trust Ian. But if Ian's agent goes to Snowflake and looks at some private customer information, that agent we don't may not trust to have the same level of trust with that agent. And as a result of that, right now we don't have any way to control that. Hey, if it's Claude Code or Claude Cowork or ChatGPT or some homegrown agent that's operating on Ian's behalf, we want to be able to have different rules and requirements on the fact that it's Claude Code versus whether it's Ian. And that's ultimately at the end of the day the biggest challenge for security teams. I think the second component is because of that reality, teams feel like three primary pains. The first pain is today, all of the agents you use ultimately have consent fatigue built into them in the sense that because they don't have fine-grained permission, they don't have a way to understand, hey, what are API calls or tools I should use? They basically rely on the human to basically say yes, no to every tool call. And as a result of that, humans ultimately get consent fatigue and we start reading what the thing says and we just say yes to everything. And then that's how accidents happen because I gave an agent high privilege to an access sensitive system. And then it exfiltrated that data into like a GitHub that someone read, or it did something it shouldn't have, like deleted a database or whatever. The next problem is that's a fundamental issue. The next problem is they ultimately have no track record of what they're operating on, and they don't have a way to like do corrective action. So if an agent becomes malicious, how do I know what access that agent actually has to what systems with what credentials? And then ultimately, how do I go and revoke that access? And then finally, the biggest challenge for these folks is actually how do I enable my team to be able to use agent with approved tools and with approved access in a way that makes it really easy for them to get up and going and using um, agents in production. So how do I give them like, here's how you actually bring our Snowflake, how you can use Snowflake in the context of ChatGPT, or here's how I use it in the context of Claude Code, or here's how I use it in the context of this homegrown agent thing we've built. Those are the primary problems for security. And then more importantly, the biggest challenge for them actually is businesses are going through this like generational shift, right? We're going from a world where it was like very human driven workflow to a world that's to a world where ultimately every enterprise wants to become some level of like a Waymo. They want to become autonomous in the way that they work. And in order to do that, you actually have to go through this full lifecycle transformation. And at the core of it, what they're looking at is, hey, I don't just have like an ability for my uh, end users, my employees to be able to use my internal systems. I actually don't have the tools for me to actually build my own agents, and I don't have the tools for me to turn my company and my products into agents and give my end customers like a strong security guarantee. Like this is a problem that's felt across the entire life cycle, and every interaction point that needs to become agentic. And as a result of that, they're looking for like a strategic bet that they can make, and that's what we're doing at Keycard.
Is it possible for you to just walk us through a real scenario where this falls apart? Like, what does failure actually look like in production? For those who have not experienced it yet, they know what to expect.
Yeah, I think from an organizational perspective, there's a lot of failure scenarios. One is like the thing we read, right? Which is um, a good example would be the Light LLM attack or the Axiom supply chain attack that happened like 2 weeks ago. Is a developer's using a coding agent. That coding agent installs like a package that has a vulnerability in it. That coding agent has brought like because of where it's running and because of how the act secrets and things that agent has access to that vulnerable package then exfiltrates those credentials, and now you have a problem. So the biggest issue is like, hey, this thing has taken our state secrets and made it available to the internet or to an attacker in a way that we couldn't control or didn't anticipate. And the way that our systems or security model set up and didn't anticipate this as being like a type of vulnerability, right? We didn't anticipate endpoints or coding agents or non-deterministic actors having access to, high, like these, basically the keys to our kingdom. So what do we do with that? That's problem number one, right? That's the big thing. It's like, okay, how do we prevent ourselves from basically getting pwned one way or the other? The next problem that shows up in organizations is as soon as people start adopting an agent, whether it's like a Microsoft 365 Copilot, a Cloud Code, or Open a Codex, ChatGPT, they immediately, you want to be able to bring business context into those agents one way or the other. And so the problem is like, how do I do that in a way that actually from as an IT or security team, I'm doing it securely, but more importantly, I am enabling them to do it in a secure way where I'm not feeling the pain. And that pain can be felt through a bunch of different methods. One is a lack of visibility, and I discussed with this earlier, like how do I know what these things are actually doing and what they're accessing? But more importantly, what ends up happening for people that don't have the right system is you get an endless number of like like access requests. Like they have people going to the IT team, be like, hey, I need these API keys or need these credentials, I need to access the system. And they don't have the fidelity of control to actually control what that means because they're basically giving out like broad-based access. But more importantly, they actually are just like getting littered with tons of IT tickets they can't manage. And finally, the way this shows up the organization is ultimately they have to make a decision. And the organization has to decide, hey, are we going to like really lean into this agent thing and really take on a bunch of risk and like really have people like kind of struggle through enablement? Or are we going to say, hey, we're not ready for this right now and shut it all down? And ultimately, in both paths, you're either taking on a huge amount of like actual security risk in the sense of like letting agents run free, or you're taking on a huge amount of market risk and like in the sense that you are not being able to compete with, you know, your competition. You're not able to keep up with what the expectations of the market as people adopt agents and they realize productivity gains and like the the standard for what earnings should look like for a company change in the publics and that then moves down the private. That's what we're seeing in organizations across the board in terms of how these pains show up. And all of these centralize down into we all want to become users of agents. And increasingly want agents to take on more responsibility on our behalf. And we want our businesses to become more autonomous in nature and realize more automation and then realize those productivity gains. But there really is like a central component missing to connect all these different ways, all these things together so that we get the security controls and experience we want. But the people that are trying to build or use agents or agentic workflows can do it in a way that they're actually not taking on a bunch of risk either. And it makes it easier for them to adopt. And that's the core of the problems we see over and over again in most organizations. And I think as a result of that, what we commonly hear from the CISOs and CIOs is some combination of, we don't know where to start. Help us understand where we should start and help us understand how we start doing this sort of organizational transformation. And I think, the key question, our key answer is, well, really, ultimately, it's about enabling people to actually use these things and experience the magic. Once you experience the magic safely, right? That's when you can start, people learn about new ways to work and they start being quite imaginative in how they deploy it and how they use it. And then you also need to enable them to grow those use cases over time.
If you look at a lot of these systems, they are non-deterministic by design. So how should identity itself evolve? As we discussed, these things were developed before the whole ChatGPT, AI, MCP came into existence. So, it's not right to call them legacy, but a lot of things are changing because of AI. So how do you think identity should evolve when software is operating across multiple environments and making decisions not only in a way that are not fully predictable, but at a speed that a human cannot match either?
Absolutely. So this is a really great question. And so ultimately, I think of this very much like the rise of enterprise SaaS, right? When we moved to the cloud and you had the explosion of different SaaS being bought in the enterprise and you ultimately had like user management problems. Like, how do I ensure that I can control what these users are doing and actually give them access to these systems? It looks a lot like that. The problems are different in terms of like what actually has to be built to solve it. But is a very consistent model. So from that perspective, agent identity is different. You have something that is inherently delegatory. So you need the ability for an agent to have a concrete identity that is different than anyone else in the system. That is a stable identifier. You need the ability you have to basically think of agents as apps in a formulation. You then have to think about like delegation. So these types of users are able to delegate this type of access to this type of agent, that type of agent for these types of systems. And then what you need to do is then basically be able to like advertise that to your end users and then build in systems from a security perspective, like policy that says, this is when a human must be involved in a decision an agent is making on their behalf. And this is when we don't need that to happen.
We also hear a lot of talk about making access decision at execution time using full context. What does that mean in practice?
It's a really good question. And so ultimately, what we're realizing is that if at the end goal, from a security perspective, is that we want to be able to apply deterministic rules to non-deterministic systems, which is that we want guarantees around what these things are capable of doing. But we also need to realize that that's done based on the like on a per task basis, right? So we need to interpret the intent, like the system, the identity system needs to be able to interpret the intent of the agent, understand who it's acting on behalf of, and then use that intent to determine whether or not a decision or an API call should be made. And in traditional systems, like we don't have the granularity of the delegation chain, so this the ability to actually delegate. Moreover, you don't have the ability to change that depending upon the context that tool call that's being made, right? And this is really about moving the enforcement point from the point of token issuance, which is saying we're going to say, does this user like have access to the system, or does this agent have access to the system? To moving to, hey, in the context of the session and the task that's being done, can this user actually perform this action? And if they need additional permissions, how does that agent actually get the additional permissions so it can perform the action it's trying to perform? Yes or no?
And when we talk about context here, what kind of context we are talking about? What signals feed into that decision?
It's a really good question. I think this is something we're still trying to understand, but minimally it is what are the prompts, right? So what does the user said to the system that, hey, I want you to do this? And how, when we look at that prompt, we have to interpret that and say, what is reasonable access for that agent to have one way or the other, right? Based on what that agent's job is in the organization. So, hey, is it ChatGPT? And the context here being it's operating on behalf of like a person on our sales team or a person on our development team. And then also the context being using what application. So for example, our CRM or our GitHub. And then more importantly, what then understanding is that intent, what the task is trying to do, the access it's requesting, is that aligned with our security policies and aligned with what the user actually wants from this prompt.
From team's perspective, tools are there, but let's talk about governance. Let's talk about best practice is an overblown word. So let's not use the term best practice, but right practice. How can teams give agents enough access to do meaningful work without giving up on visibility, governance, and control?
Yeah. So I think first and foremost, this is a really early space. And so there's lots of different answers. Ultimately, in the long run, what we want is going to be our standards will emerge that gives the appropriate hooks and data so we can have proper federated identity systems. In the short term, it's about how do we create a green zone effectively where these agents can operate with our security assumptions and operate to our risk model, and then enable that to then how do we grow that over time as the standards evolve and ensure those things become standards interoperable. And what we do at Keycard for our customers is we enable them to deploy like a ChatGPT, enable them to deploy a Codex, enable them to build their own agents, and take those agents into production and give them access to tools without giving up control. So they get full end-to-end auditability of, hey, this agent is performing this type of action, gives access on this person's or other agent's behalf, and they can then look at that data and be able to revoke that access one way or the other or change policy. And that gives you like an end-to-end life cycle ability to actually govern what agents are able to do what things on whose behalf in what systems.
Last question before we wrap this up. If I'm a security or platform leader watching this, what are the early warning signals that my current identity stack is not ready for agents? And what are the first steps I should take to ensure that I can successfully, without worry, give agents access, but have full visibility, control, and governance?
Absolutely. So first sign is you have users asking for access to systems they typically don't want access to or things they don't have access to. And second is using your endpoint security solutions. These agents are running on your environments or they're asking you to deploy these things, right? So typically agents show up in your company and they look a lot like shadow IT. That's the first sign that there's something going on. The second question is, okay, now that you know you have them, how do we like enable people to actually use agents and give them tools such that we can control what those agents are, so we can govern what type of agents are operating in our ecosystem, and more importantly, what tools they have access to. And this will show up, a lot with like shadow IT. So you see things accessing your systems you didn't before. And also you have a bunch of user access requests or user actions that don't look normal. So the high velocity of actions are atypical. The next step is say, well, okay, we can't, like, we either have to decide to lock this all down or we have to deploy something. And then you want to go to market and you want to look for a solution that enables you to actually get real governance and control over agents and operate across all these different systems and provide them access to tools. But the most important component when you think about that is this is a very early space. You're really making a bet on team and technology that's going to take you over time to where you want to go. What's going to be like the core foundation that actually enables this transition? And how does it integrate with the stuff I have today? So how does it integrate with my pre-existing human identity systems, my pre-existing customer identity systems, and my workload identity systems to create a whole end-to-end solution for us in the company?
Again, thank you so much. After listening to you, I think the big takeaway here is that agentic systems need identity and access models that are dynamic, contextual, and enforced at the moment of action, not just pre-configured ones and forgotten. And also it needs active involvement for teams to make it work as well. Thank you for sharing all these insights, and I look forward to chatting with you again. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure. Talk to you soon.